the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, just want to mention we've got a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. Today, we are going to be digging into the introduction and chapter 1 of Gilbert Simondon's On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. Chapter 1 is titled Genesis of the Technical Object, the Process of Concretization. So what's funny about this, I'm like nodding along as I'm reading the text, and I'm like, oh, I'm like the Mark Cuban gif, like, oh, taking notes. And I'm like thinking, okay, I can kind of see how Deleuze mobilizes this general kind of thesis of Simondon. But then I get to like the very end of the chapter 1, and it's a total like M. Night Shyamalan twist. And he's like, well, we have to be a bit cautious about applying these relations to the sort of biological and the cultural and the social, which kind of punched me in the balls. I was like, well, what? Like you just pulled the rug out from under me here.
It's interesting because in another piece, he will go into how the machine relates to communities and societies, which he distinguishes between, right? Communities for him are like closed insofar as they impose a kind of automatism of codes. So that's one aspect of like the primitive territorial machine and like Deleuze and Guattari. And then societies are like these they're more dynamic insofar as they address problems. And so they call themselves and the individuals that compose them into question and are able to work that way. Whereas communities are really applying a code, and in that sense, can't call themselves into questions. They're more solving questions that are presupposed rather than posing problems. His main thing was to say, no matter how far we take this process that he's examining of concretization, no matter how far we take it, there's a rapprochement between the natural object and the technical object, but there's always going to be that limit that can't be crossed. If we use external analogies and resemblances, then we might fall prey to identifying the technical object with the natural object, which he wants to bring it closer to, or show how concretization brings us closer to a natural system in its functioning and internal resonance, but never quite gets us there. Let's not fool ourselves, because if we do that, then we get back into the conundrum that he's posing throughout these two theses, throughout individuation in light of notions of form and information, and throughout the mode of existence of technical objects. He has a lot of work that calls into question the antagonism between man and machine, either the dominance of over machines and reducing them to servants, which for him is a mode of like consumerism, where really they're not even servants anymore. They're like flatterers. We can think of like the Cybertruck, the way that Simondon analyzes. It's the newest trend that becomes a symbol of one's participation in a kind of prestigious little group. If one looked at the Cybertruck from Simondon's analyses of the technical object, we can see that what exactly does it improve upon? And in fact, overlays a lot of inadequacies, or what he calls in the text inconveniences, with the inessential,
right? The inessential is what can be bespoke or made to measure, is the language of the text itself.
Yeah,
which I think is interesting, because this goes back to who was it we were speaking to? Was it about Jason Reed, about how the universalism of labor kind of grinds off the fine edges of the individual and produces this kind of
Yes.
universal subject of capital. It's comparable to this metaphor of artisanal production versus industrial production.
I guess that makes sense too. And of course, as you were just mentioning before the show, docile bodies. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari are very keen to show the way in which culture, broadly speaking, not the culture that Simondon's calling for, which again he calls for throughout his writings, for this like general technical culture, which we'll get to more later in the book. But I mean, culture in the Nietzschean sense of like training, that's part of the rounding off of making good workers. Now, in terms of the universal subject, I think that's for Deleuze and Guattari and Marx a bit more of an abstract conjugation of flows, right? The conjugation of the flows of money as abstract equivalent, and the conjugation of the quote unquote free in the double sense laborer. That is a historical event, obviously. But I think what you were talking about, yeah, the rounding off the edges of the ability to de-skill and reskill, kind of as though modular pieces in the puzzle of labor. Sure, that I guess that's another form of universality. Getting rid of the singularities, the asperities.
Just like we talked about with the wood in the original Simondon episode we did, right? It's like the artisan may work with the wood and its flows and its like quote unquote imperfections, whereas the machine, it acts as a sort of universal, you know what I mean?
Not all machines, though. Simondon is very clear. It does depend on the machine you use. Depending on the wood, I guess his point was like a lot of the machines, you're right. Not all of them, but a lot of the machines. Some of the simple machines, like a paring knife.
Yeah, no, that's true, right?
I mean, and we may not think of that as a machine. We may think of that more as a tool. So I will,
right.
You're right. There is this sense in which an artisanal labor respects the wood singularities by using something more like a tool. But there are some machines that might be better suited to certain wood, and depending on the desired effect, right? Porosity versus, waterproofing.
Right.
I don't, it's not viscosity, is it? I'm trying to think of a word for it. Density, the opposite of porosity or whatever. But yeah, I think his main example is like the lathe, which just kind of, it doesn't give a shit about the singularities of the wood, is what you're saying, right? It just does its thing
by brute force,
because you're trying to make a uniformity of these planks to be used. You're not necessarily trying to bring out the implicit forms of the wood. I would say you're right on the whole about the way in which those kind of machines he's analyzing in the wood example aren't necessarily allowing the worker to receive a kind of direct information with with what he's working with, whereas obviously a whittling knife is, you're not just cutting away. I mean, I'm sure you could if you're just making a pointed stick. Like if you're making a spear, you may not care about the singularities as much as some basic requirements. And obviously the aesthetic objectives are different. The point being, it's interesting how Simondon he does give some concrete examples, some of which I think were very relevant for his day and for someone working in the laboratory and conducting experiments like he was. So, he's talking about anodes and cathodes and triodes and pentodes and the development of this technology. And he sees it in an evolution that is very interesting. But he starts mainly at first with these kind of general statements, goes into particular examples, and tries to draw out this movement, as you're pointing out, of abstraction, which he, as you said, the word I think is a pretty good translation, the to measure type of creations versus the concrete systematic criteria that he's looking for, right? So this question of abstraction is interesting, and I think
this is where Baudrillard comes into play, right? the simulacra.
How so?
Like in the sense just of, broadly speaking, abstraction and systematicity, and maybe towards just capital as this dominant system of being or mode of being, right? Marx, starting from the relation of production, from artisanal labor, which has like a, I don't know, it sort of respects to some degree difference and singularity, to the oppressive universe, like the production of docile bodies, like the production of the universal labor. And then this having a sort of analogous relation to cultural systems. The cultural systems all begin to reflect this same relationship and dive further and further into abstraction. Trying to think of a good example would be something like, I don't know, Minecraft. People building or I don't know if you saw this, but someone posted this week, they're hiring people to work in Roblox, in the IKEA within Roblox.
In terms of the way he's talking about abstraction and the concrete, I don't see how that relates to simulacra yet. Okay. I feel like it's a different criterion, right? Because he's talking about the abstraction of a technical object and its evolution towards the concrete. And he's not necessarily talking about abstract labor per se, at least not yet. Does that make sense?
So yeah, I mean, let's start with, I think actually should probably start with concretization, or the concrete, to open up the podcast, really, because that was, I think, the big question. I wasn't so clear on what he meant by concretization. Now, he gives some great examples.
Yeah,
I think the aviation example perhaps was a really good one. I think that
So the way that he first starts to describe it, and he does define it in various ways, but the way he first starts to describe it is, for example, because he's obviously writing this in 1956, and he's like, look, you can't even necessarily say that in an abstract way based on use or based on what's current, that the 1956 combustion engine in my automobile is better than the 1910 one.
Right.
He will say that the engine in general in 1956 has evolved and has become more concrete. And the reason being is that each structure is converging and bringing together in a systematic way more and more functions in a way that, while seemingly more complicated in an abstract way based on use, is actually simpler in terms of the organizational synergetic unity, what he would call, we've discussed this before, internal resonance, but now we're talking about internal resonance of the parts in a system in a technical object rather than crystal or in living beings. So his point, though, is that if the 1910 engine is more abstract insofar as each part is sort of more fulfilling one function in relation to another part that's fulfilling its function, and there's less of a network going on, right? There's less of a resonance between the parts. Each part is doing its own thing, and all together they produce this effect. His point being is that maybe the 1910 engine is good for certain things because it can be easily taken and outfitted to another use. It can be put and be an engine on a motorboat without much tinkering. Whereas as the engine becomes more and more concrete and the parts become more and more, the causes and effects become more and more part of the systematic interworking of the parts rather than the parts doing its one thing. That, I think, is how he sees concretization. And he even defines it as taking the inadequacies, that which is kind of an obstacle to the, efficiency.
Good. I'm glad you're going here. Good.
And this is where he definitely sounds Hegelian. And
we can
get into that.
Air-cooled engine versus water-cooled engine. The key distinction being that the water cooling engine is sort of an additional, I don't even know how to articulate that, but the way that the negative of something like wind resistance, right? Because if we're thinking about the function of the automobile, in some degree, we want to minimize wind resistance, right? Because as you build speed, the more that the vehicle is obstructed by the force of wind, the slower and less efficient it is. So what the genius move is to take the negative of wind resistance and utilize that for a positive function of air cooling the engine, a naturally aspirated engine versus a water cooled engine. So in that sense, you're
internalizing the functions.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that's the same reason why he goes from a gas engine so the spark that combusts the gas is external to the engine as a whole, and then that gets the combustion going. Whereas you go to a gasoline engine, you have
I
the
think you were diesel.
carburetor.
You said gas first, but I think you meant diesel, maybe.
Well, we're moving towards diesel.
Okay,
right?
gotcha.
Because as we internalize, we go from the gas engine where the function of combustion or the function of lighting the spark, the function of priming the combustion, and the function of keeping it going, that's external. Then you go to the gasoline engine and it becomes internalized through carburation, right? Using air, for example, mixing with gasoline to be able to internalize that combustion process, keep it going. And then diesel takes it even further, where it's able to use this process in a way that is part and parcel of the functioning of the pistons. And this is one of the reasons why you still see like 18-wheelers on the road having to travel much further. Diesel engines are not only better in the sense in which Simondon is talking about internalizing the dynamics and systematizing them, but also making it a part of the efficiency of the system.
Yes, absolutely.
Where there may be other problems about what to do with the exhaust from diesel and how that affects that leads us to other problems outside of the technical object.
True.
But within the functioning of the diesel engine, we know that those are longer lasting. That's one example of an evolution from an abstract partes, extra partes, right? Parts are outside of each other, but they come together to make effects, each producing their own little thing, to them becoming, I mean, you can think of rhizome, whatever the fuck, to them becoming more intricately resonating within a system. So concretization is a bit of a synonym for systematization if we think about the parts becoming more intricately bound together and the structures being able to fulfill more than one single function. They're fulfilling more functions in a way that it took more parts to do on their own. But I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say something like, in a zombie apocalypse situation, a diesel engine is preferable. Like the way that the starter works on a diesel will be able to be more robust than an electric starter, right? That's going to have this other kind of, like I was going my example of the water cooled versus the air cooled engine from Simondon. It's this added system. It sort of doesn't flow with
your
the functioning of the system.
Interesting. Yeah, exactly. Your hypothesis is interesting because the question would be, how much easier would it be potentially to get electricity to an electric vehicle versus the shelf life of gasoline or even diesel, right? We know that there is a limited shelf life for those, gasoline and diesel. So unless you have a way of synthesizing, whether it be, I don't know, you can imagine ethanol potentially as the easier, if you're able to grow corn, whatever. Obviously, that hypothetical will be taken in a bunch of different ways.
Batteries devolve or lose their capacity.
That's also true.
Their capacity degrades more quickly than, I would say, like a diesel fuel or a diesel engine's ability to start would be. So that's kind of an interesting, I don't know, development.
But I guess that kind of shows that there's something similar with. This is why Simondon says, like, as you become more concrete, the technical object likens itself more to a natural being because it's able to internalize its milieu, just as a living being internalizes a certain pre-individual milieu. Yet at the same time, like you and I, as living beings in a post-apocalyptic world, we might have to think about questions of water and shelter, not just from zombie attacks, but from the elements, food, those things that we can't fully just take along with us, but that we need fuel as well, right?
Right.
Obviously, these are.
I mean, the still suit reclaiming the body's water would be
Yeah,
a concrete.
right.
That would be like a move in towards concretization because it's taking
Yes.
the negative loss of moisture and reincorporating this negative effect into the positivity, like you're saying. And what I forget the word phrase you were elaborating regarding the like resonances between
The internal resonance.
yeah, there's sort of an right. Am I right? There's a kind of resonance going internal resonance between the body's moisture and the suit
Yeah, I mean,
or the system.
sure, we can imagine an evolution of the still suit from, I don't know, like,
Robes that you would wring
well,
out. They're more like you would wear light robes, maybe some type
like
of
they already do in the desert, right?
right, like the fabrics that would be breathable, etc., but that would trap moisture and keep the body cool. But then also you could also integrate a type of fiber that is, let's say, resistant to bacterial growth, etc., that you could actually then reharvest the water by like, you know what I mean, like wringing
So
out
you're
the moisture and
internalizing the
reclaiming it.
catheter. You can see like the catheter as one of the ancestors of the still suit, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's
Right.
funny actually. I'm surprised that they like wouldn't have their actual a cathter. I mean, I don't think Herbert maybe necessarily wanted to go into that.
Maybe not, but you'd have to think,
specific.
what do you do? What do you do with? You would assume there would be a kind of internalized catheter, or like it would plug into your bladder somehow, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
you would think that that would be a part of the still suit, and through the, again, as you said, you don't have to go into those details, but on the other hand, for us thinking about this, we need to think about what Simondon wants to see at the beginning of the process of concretization. And we could say you could find it in the abstract, in the artisanal mode. I think that's just an example. It's hard to say that that's like a historical period, and then you have the industrial and you get concrete, because for him, it's very easy to see how cultures could take, and he has this point where he's like, real concretization takes place through these discontinuities and leaps rather than these minor adjustments, which really for him is a part of consumerism, is a way of overlay. For example, he's thinking about how,
I mean, iPhone is an example.
There are ways in which, well, I mean, we could, there are ways in which like overlaying a shiny, overlaying a kind of user interface that looks friendlier, but actually hasn't really done anything to advance. Sure, when I think of the iPhone, I think about the way in which the IP laws and the way in which making things more complicated and just to have another patent on it. That's a whole other can of worms, but I think it does go into this interesting movement that Simondon is talking about, that what may seem like a concretization is actually just a kind of new trend or a way of luring and lulling the consumer into a shiny new object. I said the Cybertruck, but I think the iPhone works well on certain levels. On other levels, we could see how smartphones in general, maybe not the iPhone in particular, right? But smartphones in general did lead to an internal resonance of many different functions. You took the PDA and the kind of tablet functions and all kinds of different functions. So it did become a multimedia device in its own right that you and I didn't. I mean, we may have had cell phones for a while there growing up, like as teenagers, but the things that smartphones can do and integrating, in that sense, smartphones true. iPhones, I agree with you, especially when you look at the IP laws. But I know that takes us a little bit outside of the.
But I mean, even just like now, the camera gets incrementally better, the screen gets infinitely better, but it's not evolving in the way that the initial iPhone, that's a punctuated equilibrium. Versus like this consumer model is one of phyletic gradualism. You know what I'm saying? But
I do agree with you on there. I do agree with
that
you.
That was more so my point.
And
I think.
And one of the things that Simondon could obviously talk about now he hasn't yet gotten into consumerism. He talks about it elsewhere, but you can imagine him discussing, and maybe at the time it wasn't as much of it probably was on the horizon, planned obsolescence, turn in your old phone, get a new phone. but how much in the way of concretization has gone on? I mean, maybe graphics are a little bit better, maybe, but you're still able to text, you're still able to call, still able to go on the internet. So in terms of concretization, you're right about bringing in this question of punctuated equilibrium. I think that that's exactly that's not the language he uses to describe, right. But I think that that's perfectly valid to describe his argument that it's really these leaps, these quantum leaps, that it's not this continuous modulation in terms of the creativity involved in the evolution of technical objects along the way of concretization. So I think that is correct.
It's like the way that all right, in Anti-Oedipus, you've said this a million times, the way that the state comes together like lightning. It's like all of these preconditions for the leap, the punctuated equilibrium to occur, right? Like they're sort of dormant, but they're all the series are all coalescing to a point. And when that point of actualization occurs, it's like lightning. Maybe I'm being too artsy here.
No.
Do you see what I'm saying as far as like
sure
the preconditions exist, discontinuous areas, but whenever you can link these systems together in a certain way, then there's potential for some type of new invention.
I agree with that. And
or just evolution or something.
Yeah, and it's interesting for Simondon to point out the discontinuities also imply that sometimes the little modifications, specifically in consumerism that he's thinking of, the little advances, the new shiny object can hide the true structural inconveniences that one needs to go through in order to actually further concretize the technical object.
Yeah.
And they can also leave aside other inventive possibilities whose virtual conditions never got to accumulate the potential to actuate new.
Nice.
And precisely, I'm not sure exactly if he's thinking
that's excellent.
Consumerism alone, because we can think about these outside of the 20th century. But I think that today that is probably a product of capitalism getting in the way of innovation, because
for sure
it's not. And Marx himself talks about the way and the slowness with which innovation is adopted by capitalists and all of that, right? It kind of has to force one's hand in order to take up the anyway. That's, again, the examples he gives of concretization. We brought up the different engines. Obviously, I think for Simondon, the gas engine is the true ancestor of the engines of automobiles and not the steam engine. But it has to do, again, with the fact that for him, it's a different lineage. It's a different type of convergence.
Different machinic phylum.
You're on a different part of the plane, if you will. You're on a different part of the phylum. Yeah. But we can think about how the steam engine did have its own progeny. We can think about, I don't know,
Stanley Steamer had
whatever heats your homes, right? With the
like a radiator.
Radiators. I was thinking, what's it called?
I was thinking about how literally Stanley Steamer, like I think if you go to the Stanley Hotel, they have steam powered vehicles.
There you go. So yeah, I think that for him, we can go back. I think that for him, the true ancestors of technical objects, of true technical objects are, he'll even call them technical essences. And so I think
which was interesting. Yeah, it goes back to Heidegger.
I don't know if he means essence in that sense.
Right. I'm not saying that he did, but it just brought to mind the essay on
question concerning
technologies.
I think that technical essence, and it's interesting he's using such an old philosophical word, but what is instead of asking what the essence of technology is, Simondon is asking what is the essence of the technical object. So it's kind of interesting that he's like, look, if we had a general technology in the sense of a of a study like ontology, but he calls it also mechanology. If we had a general mechanology, we could see in true technical objects a kind of way of working back towards a source. And so in the still suit example that you gave, I do think that obviously the evolution of the type of garb worn by nomads in the desert is one. I think the catheter has to be one. Whether or not we have other types of, I mean, maybe, as an analogy in the living, I think Muad'Dib, the little rat, is the analogy that Herbert tries to draw on.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's
right, and that's kind
animal,
of okay. So that's a good example of the way that the technical resembles the concretized. I don't know. What did you say? I forget what the term you. Well, you were saying like
but it's not an external analogy, right? You're not becoming a mouse. It's not like you're making a mouse suit.
Right.
You're seeing the internal resonance of the functions, the structures and functions of that little rat. What type of rat? What's it called? What's the rat called?
It's like a kangaroo mouse or something.
A kangaroo mouse, whatever. So
something like that.
So it's equipped in such a way, its organs are predisposed in such a way as to allow it to maximize it cools itself off by the sweat, but the sweat is reabsorbed back into its living system. And so there is a sense in which its structures and functions are synergizing in a certain way that can be used as an inventive impetus to build something. Now, but again, that itself doesn't provide us with the technical essence, but it can give us indications for how the technical object could evolve and tackle certain inadequacies. Like our inadequacies, we sweat to cool ourselves off, but we need to do something similar. We need to take that inconvenience of losing water essential to us and use that as the means of propelling the evolution of, again, this is hypothetical and this is science fiction fantasy, but it makes sense because the reason why it's not just fantasy is because we can imagine it being applied. We can imagine that scientific knowledge, that biological knowledge of that kangaroo mouse fomenting invention, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally.
I do think the catheter would be one of those technical essences that would be considered an ancestor of the still suit. If the catheter could then be taken as a means of reabsorption of the liquid in a healthy way. So maybe the catheter itself isn't the technical essence. It would have to be transformed. I don't know if there are these things already but you can imagine soldiers in Vietnam, if they would have had something like that, maybe there would be less dysentery. I don't know. Right. You get what I'm saying, right?
No, I guess the interesting philosophical corollary here is how is this, because this sounds very Hegelian in the negation or the alpha bung or the sublation, if you will, or whatever term you want to throw out in terms of harnessing the negative.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. This is something that we only get indications of, like in the introduction, when he talks about this non-dialectical temporality of the evolution of the technical object. And I think that all I will say here is it's similar to Nietzschean philosophy in the way Deleuze talks about the difference between double affirmation housed around a negativity, a negation, versus double negation. Now, I know that may seem inadequate, and I don't want to necessarily take us outside of the bounds of what we read today.
Yeah, that's fair.
We're obviously going to keep reading Simondon.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's the fact that the inadequacy, the inconvenience, whatever the language Simondon sometimes uses, that obstacle is taken. That's not itself taken as something to be negated. It's the very fact that it is a positive circumstance for creating another another positivity. I guess the question would be of you affirm the problem as a problem rather than, and his point being the double negation would be to not go through the inadequacy, but to merely mitigate it, or the word he uses, he talks about it in terms of palliatives, as though you can just make these little corrections that don't actually lead to an innovation. They just try to diminish the actuality of the problem rather than taking it as the thing to go through. Now, again, I don't think that itself constitutes a critique of Hegel or the non-dialectical aspect of. I don't think that's enough to get us there, because I do feel like that would be to simplify and kind of distort the dialectic in Hegel's terms.
Sure.
One of the ways in which Simondon talks about it elsewhere, and he proposes the term transduction as an alternative to this dialectical movement, one of which I think for Simondon is the very fact that there is a total, for him, there is a way in which we have to think very differently about teleology and finality. So I don't think he wants to trace back to a technical essence a telos that was already inherent there. I really do feel like it's really more of a critique of Aristotle and entelechy, right? Where the ends were already contained in the acorn, right? The oak tree was already in the acorn, and that kind of thinking. I think that if we think about that, we're again making these external resemblances between the technical object and a natural object. And we're going to be thinking of it as though the technical essence is a seed and it just naturally kind of flowers in a way in which the end results, the concrete diesel engine is already contained in the earliest combustion engines. I think for Simondon, that's a kind of that type of overdetermination of the evolution of technical objects is what he wants to guard against. And so I think in a vulgar Hegelianism, that type of dialectic might be prominent. I don't think Hegel himself is that naive, but I'm not really here to defend Hegel. So,
what do you think about, okay, so you bring up temporality. I'm pretty sure that there was an aspect of this that I highlighted in the text here. Let me see if I can find this.
I was referring to that part that you brought up, but we can go deeper into that quote.
So I was thinking about maybe this below quote reminded me a little bit of Troglodyte, for lack of a better word, but like this temporal retroactivity, recursivity. Sorry for disrupting us.
Yeah, that's fine.
But I don't know. There was something about that reminded me of this sort of non-linear time.
I mean, I do think that the evolution of technical objects is non-linear for him. And it goes to what I said, where Simondon's like some innovations never went all the way to becoming concrete, and they were abandoned for various reasons. Either they fell out of fashion, or another product came on the market that seemingly improved upon them, but in a way that didn't actually go to the end of its evolutionary tendencies. This is the one time I saw him using the word virtuality. I would have to find where that is, but it's not a big deal. A great many abandoned technical objects are unfinished inventions that remain as an open virtuality and could be taken up again, prolonged in another domain, according to their profound intention, their technical essence. I think that that's a nonlinear type of evolution. Very much reminds me of some of the stuff Sayre talks about in the history of the sciences, where a lot of times we think of science just like building one brick on top of another as though it were this linear progress. And he's like, look, if you actually go back and look at the history of the sciences, you look at like the Sumerians and the hexadecimal system they were using base 60 in a way that reminds us of certain algorithms and calculations that would be very much at home in computer processing at base 2. So, but he's like, look, but we settled upon, based on human conventions, base 10 as our means of counting, probably because of our 10 fingers, maybe, but also the divisibility of 10 is very manipulable. You could say the same thing that there, and Sayre, I don't think, would disagree that there's a sense in which just because Base 60 is abandoned for various historical, cultural reasons doesn't mean it reached the end of what it could do. And so looking back at the history of the sciences and certain attempts that were abandoned, I mean, maybe if Reich were here today, he'd be like, hey, let's take another look again at the orgones, right? Like,
Yeah, right.
I mean, we just didn't have the means and wherewithal and maybe, but, obviously I'm half joking, but I mean, one can imagine some sort of spontaneous molecule or, alloy or some Lovecraftian metal from a meteorite that could interact with the infinitesimal organic flows of the universe. Who knows, right? I do think it's interesting. He ends the chapter with, you were saying earlier that like, oh, I was seeing some Deleuze resonances, and then the end of the chapter may have gutted you. I know we talked about it for just a second, but I mean, I think that Simondon he wants to push the notion of concretization to the point in which we can liken it to the way in which natural objects, and he means that I think in the very broadest sense, from crystals to humans, where there is an internal resonance that constitutes their growth. I think he wants to see something similar in the concretization of the technical object, where more and more there is an internalization of the milieu. He even uses that notion where, like, at first, the factory was the place in which it was, crafted, but then, like, as it concretizes, it kind of like internalizes the factory into itself. He's obviously broadly speaking, but I think I don't think he's just making a joke. I think he wants to make this likeness. And then he pushes back and wants to say, okay, but obviously the technical object can't be identified with. We can bring it closer to, but we can't identify it with the natural object. And one of the reasons why he's doing this is because he is still very much in response, I think, to the dreams of cybernetics, but also the fears concerned with cybernetics, of this question of, and before cybernetics, if you think of Chapek's RUR, this first notion of robots who are revolting against humans after being subjected, right? Simondon is trying to navigate this kind of tortuous tightrope that would pit man against machine or machine against man. He hints at this a little bit in the introduction, if you remember, where he's talking about, and this is the historical stages, I put it in very scare quotes, the quote unquote historical stages of the tool bearing stage, the industrial stage, where now machines proper in the industrial sense, industrial machines come on the scene, and now we're no longer humans just using tools. Now we are sort of in this strange, quote unquote, symbiotic, parasitic relationship with machines where we're actually being replaced by them. And then I think that for him, it's that illusion, or it's that misunderstanding, because I think he wants to call for this development of a technical culture where we can get beyond the misunderstandings of dominating machine or being dominated by it. Insofar as machines for him are always defined by the regime of information, just like any other individual. For Simondon, it all comes down to the regime of information. And yes, there are machines where feedback information is the most important. That's the one that cybernetics is focused on. And that's another reason why he critiques it, because for Simondon, feedback is already a mixed regime of information and action. There's also direct information that machines can give us with. He wants to create a true theory of machines and push back against the fetishization of automatons and automatism. He says again in the introduction, if you remember, he's like, look, automatism doesn't make the machine more perfect necessarily. There is a way in which automatism actually prevents the perfection of technical objects because it closes them off from outside information. So he wants to push back against the predominant mode of thinking of technical objects at the time. This is why he ends the chapter with a dig at cybernetics. Cybernetics not only confuses or fuses together action and information in the notion of feedback and privileges that to the detriment of other types of information. But his critique at the very end of the chapter is that, let's see, where does he start his critique? I think also too, this thing of saying, look, the concrete technical object is like a natural object, but it's when we think of the automaton as the perfect, as the most concrete technical object that we run, that's when we start to say, identify the technical object in its perfecting with the natural object. That's really his I think that's his main opponent, is the automaton as the pinnacle of technicity.
Well, if you look at humans, right, like humans are highly deterritorialized in their sense of they're not, the degrees of freedom from which a human can survive or act or like adapt enables it to reach to like not be trapped by these. If it's too specific in its, I don't even know what you'd call its ability to innovate, for lack of, I don't know if that's really that great, right? But like there's a certain openness of the system of the human system that allows it to adapt to a high variation of environments, which acts as its ability. So its ability to survive and adapt and create is very high. But then this same process, the same openness also like provides a negative in the sense of humans can adapt to anything, right? No matter how shitty or fucked up things can be, like that openness also can have a negative.
You're thinking of the terraforming of Arrakis.
I mean, I wasn't specifically, but I was thinking more so like the way that
your paradise has made you weak and all that shit, right?
No, not even thinking about that, but more like, because that's more like stagnation. But I'm saying in the context of humans adapting to any circumstances for like the longevity of survival, in a sense, like that high degree of freedom is great, but also like when it comes to human systems, the ability to adapt and not resist becomes a negative. Contemporary subjects are so acclimated to the milieu of capital that they don't like, they just flow with it, even though it may be having all these negative effects. We have so many degrees of freedom that it becomes
we can adapt to capitalism.
Right. We can adapt to slavery. We can adapt to any.
And what is playing you, make it a level 2 and all that shit, right? Yeah.
That was more so my point, which is kind of Hegelian too, right? It's like there's this double-edged sword.
Yeah. So he says technology must deal with the universality of technical objects. In this sense, cybernetics is insufficient. It has the immense merit of being the first inductive study of technical objects and of presenting itself as a study of the intermediate domain between the specialized sciences, but it has specialized its domain of investigation too narrowly because it started from the study of a certain number of technical objects. It accepted as its point of departure that which technology must reject, a classification of technical objects according to criteria established according to genera and species. Automata are not a species. There are only technical objects, which in turn have a functional organization that results in various degrees of automatism. And his point being is that the problem with cybernetics, at least in its incarnation at the time, is and one could still probably see it, is the initial postulate concerning the identity between living beings and self-regulating technical objects. This is partly what, shout out to Will from Acid Horizon, was saying about cybernetics and as a kind of science of governmentality. This hypothesis that Simondon wants to be very critical of and to push back against, this analogy, this founding analogy of the technical object and the living being. And I think that you could say that there's an aporetic moment in cybernetics that Simondon wants to try to do away with. There's an aporia, this conundrum, if you will, that leads us to, again, pit the machine against man and man against machine. And I don't think for Simondon, that's the dialectical moment to sublate. That's the wrong inconvenience, if you will. It's not an inconvenience for the technical object that it may have certain automatisms, because for him, that doesn't define the technical object. That doesn't always lead to its concretization. I think that's why he avoids that path of evolution and rejects in the introduction from the start that automatism would lead to its perfecting. In fact, it closes it off and prevents it from being this open system that allows it to be in relation with other technical objects.
Right. Yeah.
Which for him is key to its mode of concretization. And I do like that he reflects on processes of artificialization, because for him, there's ways in which artificiality isn't merely the domain of fabricated objects, which would then be the dominant way of defining technical objects, is that they were made by man. I think for him, that's not a good enough definition, because we can artificialize, as he gives the example of flowers that no longer bear fruit, and requires humans to keep them going and to transplant them in a greenhouse. I hadn't heard of this term, but he calls it the double flower. I thought that was interesting. I hadn't heard of that.
Like growing weed strains, but that's not exactly.
Well, you have to cull the males, right? You don't want the males.
Yeah. That is true.
So,
yeah. But you still are creating the flower, I guess, is the difference.
Yeah, but to a certain extent, the potency of the strains is a process of artificialization. It requires humans to cull the males from the females in order to allow for the THC process to occur in a way that it wouldn't occur to an extremis in the wild, right?
Yeah, right.
The males would ruin naturally in the wild. Not completely ruin, obviously, but they would not allow for the type of cultivation.
Yeah, for the specific function of producing high concentrations of THC. Yeah.
So there is a sense in which I think you're right to bring up marijuana. I think a lot of people can grasp that very easily, more than just these this more general example of a flower that doesn't bear fruit and has to be transplanted and grafted. I think that's a type of example that not many people would necessarily have.
I'm trying to think of, there's got to be a more like direct analogy or like example of that even. I'm trying to think of something.
But then weed?
No, that's only harvested, that like something that doesn't bear fruit, so to speak. But
I feel like it would have to be not genetically modified isn't the word I'm thinking of, but manipulated, right? Or like, I don't know. I'd never heard of this term, right? So for me, the example was a very abstract one in a different sense than abstraction and concretization. It's just
right. Yeah.
It's just not one that I could grasp my head around.
Yeah, really.
But I was thinking something similar about weed, and so I'm glad that you reminded me, because that was the same thing. I mean, just if anyone's ever tried to grow weed or just heard about it, you've got to protect the female plants, which are the ones that are going to bear what the harvestable parts to smoke and refine and to use, really, quote unquote, used by humans. You got to get rid of the males. So there is a very sense in which that is a process of artificialization, that we might not use that terminology. And I think that's why Simondon tries to bring our attention to it, that artificiality is not a good criteria for discussing technical objects. And I think that's not why, but I think this is where Deleuze and Guattari, when they start off Anti-Oedipus by making nature equals history equals industry, that great equation, they want to downplay this division between nature and art. That's a very classical division. Even someone like Emerson, who to his great merit is an amazing thinker and writer, and even Nietzsche draws on him a lot. It's like one of his favorite American writers to a certain extent. He very clearly distinguishes nature and art. Art's just whatever man has touched and modified. And I think that for Simondon, that's just not, maybe for art, but for artificiality or for whatever we think of as artificial, that's not a good enough definition, and is not.
To extend this example out a bit further, what do you think about something like the way that for growing weed, you have like a 12-hour day and night cycle that is still, even though you're quote unquote using artificial light sources, not the sun directly, right? There's an aspect of this, like you amplify the light, you line your grow room with, mylar or some type of reflective material so that you're maximizing the light exposure within this 12-hour period, but then there's also a 12-hour period of darkness. So you still have to sort of move with, kind of going back to that example of carving out the wood. You still have to sort of go with the flow of the biological apparatus of the plant to some extent. Like there's a fidelity, nevertheless, even though there is quote unquote this artificiality aspect that's been introduced, you're still moving along with sort of the flow of the plant's biological capacity, perhaps because it doesn't, the way my example for humans are humans are a far more open system than a plant, I suppose. And they lack limbs that can grasp and you know what I mean? All that sort of shit, right? By definition, I suppose you would say that they're a far more closed system than humans, would be just the point there.
I just think that their drives and tendencies are more direct. They're a little bit simpler to manipulate. I think that everything you've said about the openness of humans is correct, except there's always limits.
Surely, yeah.
And I think that this again gets us to cybernetics, which goes back to the root word for government, for governor. That's where we get the word from, pilot. You're directing, commanding. I mean, I think again, that's why cybernetics errs by over determining the technical object as that which can be either regulated or self-regulating. And I think that for Simondon, that type of automaticity, while perhaps desirable in some technical objects, wouldn't be desirable in others, and is not a universal for technical objects. And so governing, again, when you talk about humans, obviously there are limits, and there's obviously this gets us to psychoanalysis and questions of drives and questions of needs, and obviously question of desire, right? So but yeah, I mean, I think that this again is where the technical object shows itself to be much broader than mere questions of the living being. Although I think for Simondon, this rapprochement, this bringing closer together of the technical to the natural, is part of the strategy of rethinking the orientation and the emphasis we place on studying technical objects without reducing it to this question of cybernetics, this question of automatism. I think that takes us down a much narrower channel. And I do think that for Simondon has a lot of problematic bases when we conflate technics with the goals and dreams of cybernetics and the goals and dreams of automatic machines.
I think this quote might be a good little jumping off point to further this, not necessarily your point, but just the broad discussion. The technical object thus exists as a specific type obtained at the end of a convergent series. The series goes from the abstract to the concrete mode. It tends towards a state which would turn the technical being into a system that is entirely coherent within itself and entirely unified.
Yeah, I would say that the convergent series would be the manner in which structures can synergize functions or vice versa.
So like carcinogization or whatever, like the crab form?
No. I don't think so. I don't. No. That would lead us to think that all technical objects are converging towards one type of technical object to rule all technical objects, right? Or that would be the predominant way in which technical objects evolve. I just meant that insofar as the technical object has a technical essence as its forefather, right? Its progenitor, its ancestor is the word he uses. And so it has an identity and a stability that keeps it open to novelty, to what he calls non-saturation. This is the thing. I think this word is important, saturation, which we see over and over. And he likens it to the axiomatic of, let's say, a mathematical system. This notion of saturation is important because, and Deleuze and Guattari use this language. We talked about this with Eugene Holland in when they discussed the axiomatic, obviously in a different context, in the apparatus of capture of the 13th plateau of 1,000 plateaus. what's curious about the axiomatic of capitalism for Deleuze and Guattari is that it can keep adding on axioms and never get saturated. This is completely bonkers in a certain sense by the normal notion of an axiomatic system. At a certain point, an axiomatic system is saturated when we can say that it's reached an ability to become what classical mathematicians would call complete, right? All the statements pertaining to it within the system can be assigned a kind of truth value, right? Whether negative or positive or true based on its axioms. So you've reached a certain amount where another axiom added to the system would be superfluous. And I think that in the sense in which Simondon is talking about it is that, if you start from a technical essence that's non-saturated, as we go through the evolutionary tendency to become more and more concrete, we are able to take the inconveniences and the inadequacies and push them to a point where we're problem solving in a way that bring the structures and functions of this system more and more in a kind of coherence. This is the convergence that he's talking about. So it's not the convergence of a technical object toward an ideal type like the crab for whatever reason that happens on the biological phylum. It's more that we see, like with the example we gave of the diesel engine, more and more of its functions are brought and more tightly knit and intertwined in ways that everything's firing on all cylinders, which is the metaphor we use, right? That's the analogy that we use to talk about these kind of things, where every cylinder, quote unquote, is performing a function and bettering the whole rather than being an extra appendage, which would be like an extra axiom in a saturated system. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, like there's a dissipation of energy versus a integration,
something like that. Yeah, or that he uses the literal terms dead weight.
Yeah,
there can be dead weight to a system. That would be an extra axiom that's added to a saturated system. There is a way in which bells and whistles, right? We have all these terms that we use without necessarily reflecting on them. Not every machine needs bells and whistles to do something. It might look well. It might help something to sell a new coat of paint or whatever. I think that's the interesting thing, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We can even reflect on that, where Simondon would say yes and no. To a certain extent, yes. If fixing it would imply merely trying to palliate certain minor inconveniences, then perhaps fixing it would be worse.
So because fixing capitalism, but that's probably going beyond the bounds of what Simondon would be comfortable with.
I mean, this is again what we talked about with Eugene Holland and the question of axiomatics, because I think for Deleuze and Guattari, their thing, yes, is that it is that minor reforms, while not the main, impetus to overcoming the problem and tackling it head on, they don't leave aside the very fact that, this is where one could say, are we merely going to try to make things worse so they can get better? That kind of optimism is a bit naive, right? There are ways in which they do leave room for minor victories. Now, obviously, one could be a hardliner and almost want to say, but the thing is, the structural incompatibilities and contradictions persist. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one can't struggle for local causes. Otherwise, why and how would one go on? I guess that's the thing, right? Okay, so yes, I think that Simondon is not saying that every palliative is merely forestalling true innovation. But I think that his worry is that many times it can be, and that it is very possible that it could. I think it all comes down to what Deleuze later calls jurisprudence, right? It has to be a case-by-case basis. I think this applies here too. You can't say that struggling for minor reforms is in and of itself bad. I think that kind of decision, again, is a kind of vulgar Hegelianism, Marxism, accelerationism, where our goal is to keep things as bad as possible to try to like foment revolt. Because as you were already saying, there's a plasticity to the human spirit, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, that's going to adapt. Okay, well, Roe v. Wade was repealed. I guess that's just another impetus to revolt. Well, is it? Should that not be something pushed for as a right? Again, that's a question of jurisprudence. It's a question of that case. I think it's very well to struggle. Yes, you're not going to overturn capitalism by reinstating something like Roe v. Wade or making it a part of the Constitution, which would be even better. Yes, that's a minor victory in the sense of the struggle against capitalism or whatever the fuck we're talking about in this broader sense. But that's still a worthwhile thing. Here, too, I think that one could say, I think for Simondon, the main point is that minor improvements could potentially be good in the short run. But I think for him in the long-term vision, if we're thinking in the broader concretization of technical objects, for him, the modes are abrupt and discontinuous in the ways that perhaps revolutions are. I think it's on that front that we can say that, just as one cannot necessarily foresee revolutions, that doesn't mean that one is always and only struggling for the big terms. It is possible that on the way to trying to palliate and improve, there can be these spontaneous discoveries. He even allows that, but it would still be a kind of abrupt discontinuity. It's a very tenuous thing there. And again, this brings up what you brought up earlier with punctuated equilibriums and the gradualism. There is a way in which they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. We kind of have to hold those two together. But I think that for him, the gradualism alone is never going to allow us to see the leaps. And so the continual improvements may, if we take that as the focus, if we take major politics alone as the focus and ignore micropolitics, we're never going to see those leaps. So I think that that's the same thing for him. If we only keep in mind these tiny improvements and think that is how technical objects evolve, we're going to miss the bigger picture. Hopefully some of that made sense, and I kind of threw all of that together there, but yeah. I guess it kind of reminds me in this way, you can liken it, again, it's not identified with, but you can liken it with question of medicine. There is palliative medicine. For example, when we know someone's going to die, we're just going to give them morphine or something like this, right? To ease the pain. But there are ways in which we see also that an opiate crisis can come from this, when this type of measure is extended beyond the means of, now we are merely pushing a product, a very deadly one and a very highly addictive one, to treat a symptom rather than deeper, more systemic, structural types of intervention that could treat the root cause of the problem, whether it be a back injury or a neck injury or something else, right? So there is obviously a type of medicine and intervention that can just try to, like little moles popping up. We're just trying to deal with the symptoms and we're not actually focusing on the root cause. And I think that's where Simondon wants to see. It's in the systematic. He even calls it, and you just passed a quote from it, but I'm drawing on it now. It was a while back, but it doesn't matter, where there is a surplus implied by the systematic interrelation of the technical object that kind of demands for its concretization. It's the same sense where there is a structural, etiological cause of the symptoms. And if we are merely treating the symptoms and we're merely trying to reduce like side effects and drawbacks, we're never going to be focused on the technical evolution, the concretization that he's calling for, right? We're always going to miss the deeper structural compatibilities and synergy And we're going to miss the forest if we just focus on the trees, on the parts. If we just focus on a kind of external intervention. Any last remarks?
The last thing I would say, just this is kind of an addendum, would be it was kind of cool to see. I mean, this really helped me understand Machinic phylum a lot better. And like at that example from Virilio's War in Cinema about the coextensive development of the machinery of war and the machinery of film production, I thought was kind of a really cool example of that, and Machinic phyla. And like, even though you might not necessarily by common sense construe that relationship, it's super interesting to see how that kind of shit works, right? It goes back to the example of like the steam engine leading to the one might assume, you would make an assumption, but there's kind of this linearity, but that's not exactly how technical or biological evolution may operate.
Right. The steam engine has more to do with the hot water heater than a gasoline engine. So
Yeah.
you could be easily led astray. And he even pointed out like 4 or 5 different engines,
I mean,
showing how they each kind of have their own technical essence that aren't.
I think this would go to Deleuze and Guattari with regard to like, it's not what it signifies or not what it represents, it's what it does, right? So it's like not the signifier engine that really defines the object. Like if you're making that assumption, that example goes to why you can't always take these signifiers as the like germ of the whatever. I don't know how to articulate that per se, but
no, and you're right. I mean, like this is why when they look at assemblages, they talk about a draft horse being closer to an ox than a racehorse.
Right. Yeah. What did we discuss that in? That wasn't that long ago.
I think that example comes up in. I think Ian Buchanan quotes that example pretty clearly. That again goes to like Deleuze himself in different repetition, but also in Deleuze and Guattari, they downplay again Aristotle being. He said so much, so he's going to take some flack. Reducing things to genus and species, yes, we might think, well, of course, horses are all the same or something, right? Because they're all equus. And in Spinoza's point of view, and this was their point when discussing assemblages, from a Spinoza's point of view, and the relative speeds and slownesses and affects that compose these two different types of horses, a racehorse is actually much different than a draft horse is from an ox, based on what their bodies can do. And I think that's kind of similar to Simondon's point about these different types of engine. And I think that it also could be a guiding thread as we read further. I think that for Simondon, it's like based on the internal resonance of the system of information of which technical objects are capable, based on their dynamic, systematic interactions of which they are capable. That's how we should distinguish these technical essences and their evolution. Modifying this language just a little bit, I think you can get there. And I think that you don't even have to use system of information in the definition. I think it's a consequence. It's a fact that I think that's where Simondon is going to lead us to differentiate these. And he's going to then, I think he's also going to lead us towards this notion of a technical culture, which implies also a different relationship between man and machine, and also implies a different or a new and renewed understanding of alienation. I think that's what we have to look forward to in some of the other chapters coming up.
One thing we didn't discuss, which I think is pretty germane in here in like the background to some degree or extent, is like metastability.
Yes.
I don't know if I could draw out exactly. I don't know. That's just like a feeling I get. Maybe it's just because of like he has this quote about like there has to be a certain amount of stability for, something like industrial culture, society to develop. You know what I mean? The milieu has to have some type of stability, or the organism or the technical evolution like gets halted, I suppose.
I don't want to say the opposite. I think that for him, and he's using the term stability here in a different way, but I think for him, the technical essence has a stability. I almost want to say it has, I don't want to use the word identity. I don't even like the word stability there, because it's not in relation to metastability. It's in the relation to instability insofar as if one were to push through the inconveniences, then the system would collapse. I think that actually, in order to develop a general technical culture, there has to be some metastability.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that the community, which I mentioned earlier very broadly as the imposition of an automatism of codes, there has to be enough of society, the dynamic aspect of civilization.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
That allows for posing new problems and calling into question problems instead of solving questions that already are presupposed. So there needs to be at least a little bit of metastability in the way in which a community allows for the interaction of community and society, the little bit of freedom left to the individual to innovate. Exactly. If that makes sense, right?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, you could even, I think, maybe if I'm understanding correctly, you could even say this was sort of like metastability is a concept that maybe similar to what I was arguing or discussing about the openness of the human system in a sense, rather than the automata, which is like its degrees of freedom are far diminished and it only follows this one particular thing, right?
So, yeah, I think that for Simondon, the technical object itself, we can imagine a community as an absolutely closed community that imposes codes in such a way that there's no desire that leaks. Now, obviously, this is a fiction, but the frictionless society, as Plato calls it, but the frictionless community. So there's nothing that escapes the dominance of the codes. For Simondon, this would be a perfectly normative society, right? But for Simondon, there would be no way for the technical object to be integrated into that community because technical objects imply their own normativity and they imply a reevaluation of the norms and values at stake in communities. So for Simondon, there's never any fully closed civilization. If we take that broadly speaking as the interplay between community and society, there's always an interplay. There's always a little bit of leeway because as technical objects are elaborated and integrated, it implies a reevaluation of the norms and values. This is something of the dynamic aspect of technical objects. And we can see that especially at play in the 19th century. If we take that as the century of like the industrial age, right, of the explosion of, and we could even look at our more recent century with like the advent of the internet and digital shit. But if we just think about the last 2 centuries and the explosion of technical innovation and how much that coincides with capitalism's decoding of flows, we can see very much what Simondon's talking about there, right?
Yeah, excellent. That's good. That might be a good stopping point.
Yeah, and next week we get to do some Dune.
We'll call that a wrap.
Forward to. Yeah,
We'll call this a wrap for this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.